Okay, so thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Les and Rod for the invitation. I do, as you heard, I do science and technology ethics. In particular, I do the ethics of AI and robotics and the ethics of genetics and human enhancement. This talk is in that part of my work where I'm interested in the application of genetic technologies to human beings. I'll spend a little bit of time giving you a pop science understanding of the technology, and then I want to make a particular argument about the implications of genetic technologies for the future of what it means to be human. I'm kind of curious to hear what humanists think about this talk. It's not obvious to me what the humanist take on genome editing should be. I'm not a religious person myself. I'm not a particularly conservative person, but in some ways this talk shares some philosophical lineage with conservative, what's called bioconservative critics of human enhancement. So I'll be curious to see what people make of it. This is my cunning plan for my talk. I'll talk a little bit about gene editing for enhancement, and then I'm going to talk about, I'm going to make an argument that this technology of genome editing potentially makes each generation obsolete, that rapid technological progress in genetic modification of human beings might produce obsolescence in human beings. And then I'm going to talk about that process. I'm going to talk about what it would be to experience oneself as obsolete, what it would be like for other people to see us as obsolete, and then the kind of ontological implications, what it would mean to be obsolete. And then I'll say something at the end about the sort of what the take-home message. I should say I don't think of myself as giving an all things considered argument against human enhancement using genome editing. This is just one consideration. If you think it's going to be wonderful to be genetically modified, maybe you would pay the price that I'm going to highlight for you. So it's not that at the end of the talk, I'm not thinking that I've convinced you to reject genome editing, but I hope that I have alerted you to an interesting set of issues. What is gene editing, genome editing? There's a little bit of an interesting thing going on. People used to talk about genetic modification or gene editing. Now they talk about genome editing. There actually isn't anything at stake there other than an attempt to make yourself not like those other bastards who've been talking about it since the 1970s. What has changed? So people have been talking about genetic modification of plants and animals and potentially human beings since the late 1960s. There's actually a philosophical debate and quite a large literature on the ethics of genetically modifying human beings since the early 1970s. And so philosophers have been pondering this stuff for decades. What's changed now is that the science has actually caught up. In particular, the old technologies of genetic modification involved technologies that would essentially insert genetic material into an organism at random locations. You didn't have control over where the new genetic material went into the genome of the organism. Genome's the whole package of genes in the organism. The old technologies involved random insertion of genetic material. There's a new set of technologies, most famously the CRISPR-Cas9 system, that allows scientists to fairly precisely control where new genetic material goes into the target organism. And that is tremendously exciting for people who are working in fundamental biology. Its real-world impacts are going to be most radical in agriculture. We're looking at a future with massively genetically modified plants and animals, but you could also do this stuff to human beings. I'm going to be talking about genetically modifying embryos. And I'm going to be talking about the ethics of genetically modifying embryos, because if you really want to make a radical phenotype is what you're like, genotype is your genes, your DNA, your phenotype is the person you grow up to be. If you want to make radical changes to the functioning of a human being, you have to genetically modify them when they're a little tiny bundle of cells as an embryo, because that's the only way to get the genetic modification into the entire body. You can use CRISPR-Cas9 technology to do what's called somatic cell modification, to modify particular cells in your body, but it's too late to grow an extra head, for instance. If I wanted to genetically modify you so you'd have 2 heads, God knows why I'd want to do that, but for example, I can't do that when you're 40. But if I can muck about with you while you're an embryo, I can take genes now from the entire natural world, put them into the human organism, and expect large phenotypical changes. So we're talking genetic modification of the early stage human embryo, and I'm specifically interested in the attempt to provide people with beyond species typical traits. So enhancement, not therapy. This technology, so I have a published paper called Yesterday's Child. It's out in the American Journal of Bioethics, I think earlier this year. One of the fun things that happened while I was writing that paper is for a long time people thought this was all science fiction. So my paper was full of hedging. One of the problems with writing about human enhancement is that there's one group of people who thinks it's obviously unethical and probably impossible, and there's another group of people who think it's obviously ethical and we should get on with it. And if you're trying to get a paper past referees, you always hit one of each. It's very, very frustrating. Interesting, and I did hit referees who said, this is all bullshit, you're never going to be able to do it. But between when I submitted the paper and when I got the referees report, a Chinese scientist actually did this. So famously, late last year, a Chinese scientist came out and said, I have produced children who have a gene that I deliberately put into them in order to fingers crossed, make them resistant to HIV infection. So it's like a genetic version of vaccination. That was a gene that is available in the human population. So while it was an enhancement of those children, it wasn't like trans species. But you can take genes from anywhere, put them into human beings. Why am I interested in human enhancement? I'm interested in human enhancement because this technology is really only good for human enhancement. It's being pitched to the public as a cure for genetic diseases, but that's actually a con job. Because when it comes down to it, most people who have a family history of genetic disease can use a technology called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to ensure that their child is born without those genes. So pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, again, you have to do IVF, but you analyze the genome of multiple embryos and you say, look, I don't want my child to have a particular genetic condition, so you test for those genes and choose one of the other embryos. Only in very rare cases will all of the embryos that a couple could create carry the genes associated with a genetic disorder. Now, in that case, you could say, right, what I'm going to do is genetically modify those embryos to cure that disease. But you could, of course, also use donor gametes. You could use donor sperm or donor egg. So if someone says, I want to cure my child of a genetic disorder, where they're placing the moral weight is actually on having a child that's genetically related to them rather than a healthy child. Because, in the limit case, you could use donor sperm and donor egg, and the woman in the couple would give birth to a healthy child, but then people might worry, well, that child's not really mine if you have a genetic model of parenthood. But it's a funny old world where people think that it would be more appropriate to genetically modify your child with this radically experimental procedure than use donor sperm. So the kind of, the argument that this is a technology about producing health is weak. It's really about encouraging genetic relatedness, and there's lots of us in the world whose social father is not their genetic father, and we get on just fine. Lots of people out there who don't even know that mum had to make a choice about who was going to be dad, got it wrong. People live their whole lives never knowing, perfectly fine. So you can live a happy, healthy life without being genetically related to your parents. This technology is sort of motivated by an obsession with genetic relatedness, but actually what people want to do is enhance human beings. And what they didn't like about the Chinese scientists doing it was a Chinese scientist who did it rather than an American scientist who did it. Now, it is true that if you do this stuff, it's radically experimental. You don't know whether your child is going to be healthy. And that can sound sort of disastrous. It's like, oh, I'm experimenting on my child. That argument is much weaker than people think for two reasons. One, all reproductive technology is radically experimental. We still don't know that every child born of ordinary in vitro fertilization, second child conceived at Monash, all of those kids could spontaneously combust at the age of 50. Everyone born as a result of IVF, because none of them are older than 50. Spontaneous combustion's pretty unlikely, but an epigenetic cancer, who knows whether being conceived outside of the human body is really safe when you're 50 or 60. We've got no data on that. So ordinary IVF is already an experiment. If we're willing to do that, or a whole series of other reproductive technologies that people do routinely, we should take a punt on doing our genetic modification of embryos after we've done a few experiments on macaques and rats and mice and stuff. If that argument doesn't convince you, recognise that coming into existence is an experiment. Your life could go horribly wrong. Most of us experience bad things in our lives. When you choose to have a child, you're essentially experimenting on an individual. So if I want to genetically modify them, that's just part of the cost of coming into existence. Now, it's experimental for two reasons. One, even though people tell you this technology is really precise, actually people don't really know how precise it is. The genome is incredibly complicated. The whole notion of a gene is a sort of philosophical sleight of hand. The DNA is in this complex relationship with a whole cloud of little molecules and other bits on the chromosome. So when you change one thing, still don't really know what's going on. We also don't really understand the genome. So when people, for instance, try to think about improving the IQ of their child through genetic modification, we don't really know what genetic sequences are involved in IQ, for instance. If you believe in IQ at all, but even if you do, it looks as though there's hundreds, probably thousands of genes that affect people's IQ. So we don't know any of this stuff. So if someone was selling this technology to you and said, I'm going to make your child twice as smart or extra long-lived or give them, sonar or bat's ears or something, and all of that is in the literature. People are making some pretty radical claims for this technology. You should take it all with a big grain of salt. People really don't know how to do that stuff. But I'm going to drink the enhancement Kool-Aid. I'm going to believe that people are going to start conducting these kinds of experiments. For people, in part I'm doing that because a whole lot of people that I'm involved in this debate with believe that we will do this stuff. And I'm taking a punt on how the science will go in the future. I think we will never really be able to make dramatic changes in human beings' capacities through genetic modification. I don't think we'll be able to do that. But I can point to all these award-winning scientists at Harvard who think that I'm a know-nothing on this topic. One of the argumentative moves that my colleagues make here is to claim that there will be rapid technological progress. So we can't do it now, but technology is advancing rapidly. If you've seen people draw exponential curves, they get very excited about exponential increase in technological rates of technological change. Yep, we can't do it now. Give me 10 years. Millions of scientists will work on this stuff. Technology will advance rapidly and we'll be able to enhance human beings. I'm going to take that premise seriously. I'm going to take the premise of rapid improvement in technology of genetic human enhancement seriously. And what I'm going to argue is if you had it, you would generate obsolescence. Because now think about, I'm going to have a baby, I'm going to genetically modify my baby. And imagine this technology is changing at the same rate as your mobile phone is changing. So I go down to the lab, I talk to the scientists, I get the best bundle of genes for my child. Genetically modify my child, come home from the hospital with the baby, go, woohoo, I've got a super baby, and realise that the people who are now conceiving children actually get a whole new, better set of genes. People who are conceiving their children now have access, because of rapid progress, have access to a series of genetic enhancements that we didn't have access to. Yep.
Doesn't the evolution usually sort of plateau out? Like I think with mobile phones, they're probably not going to evolve much more from now on because after about 20 years of chaos, we've probably reached a reasonable design. So wouldn't you expect a similar result that after perhaps one or two generations, your evolution of children would sort of plateau out?
Okay, I mean this isn't evolution, so this is technological change. I don't know the answer to that, but there aren't any immediate reasons to think that you couldn't continue to develop superior enhancement. So I agree, this argument is very dependent on the nature of that curve, but also the rate of change. So one of the things I'll say later in this discussion is, look, if this stuff changes really slowly, and there's some reasons to think that it would, because the generational test time for human genetic modification is actually really long. So if I tell you now that your child is going to have an IQ of 200, you probably need to wait till they're 15 to actually check that. And then I say, shit, sorry, was wrong about that. Back to the drawing board, and it's another 15 years before we can test my next modification. So there are some reasons to think that the rate of change is not going to be what the enthusiasts think. But this is what's called an immanent critique. I'm going to accept arguments that other people make in the literature for the sake of developing my argument, and at the end I'll reflect on the various places that might go differently. So imagine that you're getting this rapid increase in our potential to enhance our children. All sorts of interesting things would happen. So in the future, you might meet people at a party and you say, I'm a Microsoft 1 baby. What are you? So I'm a Microsoft 3 baby. I'm a Microsoft 4 baby. So younger people would have a superior package of genetic modifications. And that's interesting because it means that older people are rendered obsolete in an interesting fashion by this technological change.
Yeah, but they will be superior to what?
Sorry?
They will be superior to what?
You can't talk about this, and indeed this is something I come to at the end of the paper. You can't talk about human enhancement without thinking that there are things that it would be better. There are differences between superior and inferior genomes. However, that actually looks quite plausible in various ways. I'm not talking fundamental moral standing. I believe in a fundamental moral equality of all human beings, but I educate my children because I think it's better to be educated than not educated. And I feed them a healthy diet because feeding your children a healthy diet actually makes a difference to the things that they can do when they grow up. In our ordinary practices of parenting, we do have a clear sense that some things are better than other things. And some of those things will have a genetic component. Now, again, I haven't done all the kind of caveats that one would do in a full-length presentation. One thing to keep in mind here is that all phenotypes, all traits, the way we are always a product of a relationship between genes and the environment. You can have poor genes, and if you're born into a rich society and a rich environment, you may flourish. The same, your identical twin, born somewhere else, may suffer badly. You can have a wonderful set of genes and be run over by a bus at the age of 5, and the genes won't do you any good. So there's always a gene-environment interaction. That being said, people who think that genes don't matter are really going to struggle to explain the difference between dogs and human beings, for instance. They share our environment, the difference is their genes. Genes do make a difference. Now, there's not single genes for any of the interesting things. There are single genes for some disease conditions, for instance. So if you're following the BRCA1, BRCA2 stuff, people are starting to have preemptive mastectomies on the basis of a genetic test. If you're doing that because you think it's better not to have breast cancer, and if you're contemplating that, one of the things that you might do is genetically modify your child to make sure that they don't have the BRCA1, BRCA2 gene.
How do you know that gene doesn't have other connections?
Good. No, you.
Which gets to the question of the nature of evolution as random processes.
Right. Okay. Good. You don't. Some cases you will discover that. So some people make this claim for bipolar disorder. For instance, there's some evidence that there's an association between bipolar disorder and creativity, for instance. So if you eliminated the genetic contributors to bipolar disorder from the human community, then we would see a decrease in creativity. When it comes down to it, that might be a trade-off that I'm willing to make. You know, and I certainly, someone who said, look, I want my child to be a great artist, so I'm going to make them bipolar. For instance, that's a hard ask. I mean, I don't think evolution is a directed process. I think it is just, you know, what it is to be fit in a Darwinian sense is nothing that you would necessarily want to endorse, for instance. But yeah, there's all sorts of connections here. But essentially, if it turns out that changing a gene made people worse off, it wouldn't be an enhancement. And that's one of the uncertainties. That's one of the places where progress will occur. Already, when this Chinese gentleman made this genetic modification, subsequently it turns out that people think that might actually have shortened the life expectancy of those kids. I.e. that genetic modification is actually already obsolete. People thought it was an enhancement, but if you're going to try to make your child immune to HIV nowadays, that isn't the way that you would do it. So that's a real-world example. And that vaccination is tricky here. That particular modification is a genetic version of vaccination. Vaccination, we think of vaccination as part of health, but vaccination is actually a superpower. It doesn't cure a disease, it gives you the power not to be infected, for instance. So vaccination is the thin edge of the wedge for human enhancement. To be vaccinated is to be able to walk amongst the afflicted in a way that previous generations of human beings have not. So one of the ways that you get an argument for human enhancement is to point out that I can preemptively increase your life expectancy by essentially vaccinating you against heart disease and cancer by trying to remove all the genes associated with those things. Now again, it might all go horribly wrong. That's why you have to presume this sort of dramatic rate of technological progress. All right, let me say a little bit about obsolescence. Obsolescence is different from natural variation because obsolescence is specifically the result of a technological process. So there's the dictionary definition of obsolescence. And this is, I think, what one of the gentlemen was referring to. When things become obsolete, you're presupposing that the new generation is better. So there's other forms of change that aren't obsolete, that don't involve obsolescence. But if someone says, oh, that device is obsolete, it's because they think the new device is better. So there's an implied ranking and the notion of technological progress implies a ranking here. You don't get a ranking unless you know the direction in which we should be changing. And I mean, I have pluralistic intuitions about human flourishing, but I do think in general, I think it's better to live longer. It's better not to suffer from various health conditions. I think intelligence is generally good for people. Compassion is generally good for people. It's not as though I couldn't imagine some things that I would want to try to inculcate in my children to make their lives better, which is to say that I believe that there's a direction in which I think we should be trying to move human beings. And maybe one of the technologies that we could use to move human beings in that direction is genetic modification. But obsolescence is about things that are produced or used. So it's not, natural variation is not obsolescent. You might say some people have a better genome than others through natural variation, but that's not the same as to say that the genome you regret is obsolete. Only obsolete if it's the result of technological change. Now, one of the places that people push me on this argument is to say, look, we already experience something like obsolescence. And if you've seen young people on their mobile phones, okay, there's actually been a change in the dexterity on the human hand. Okay, so it used to be that your index finger was your most dexterous finger. In young people, it's their thumbs. So you've actually seen the environmental influence has made a massive, I mean, it's not massive, but it's a significant change in the human body. There are things that the youth can do today that I can't do. And if I were trying to get a job in Silicon Valley, I'm too old. So there's already, and this, you're actually too old when you're 25, okay? If you're in that like Californian startup culture, people are only hot ticket items when they're like 18 to 22. By the time they're 25, people assume that they're no good. So there's already something like this dynamic occurring at the level of culture. I need to resist the analogy between genetic change and cultural change here, and maybe I'll do that in question time, but I do think that it's possible to distinguish between the ways in which skill sets become obsolete and the way in which your genome might become obsolete, not least because the change in your genome seems like a deeper change in your nature, whereas the skill sets sometimes you can kind of update. One of the things I should say about obsolescence is if you can update a technology, obsolescence is not a problem. Which is why the sort of cyborg enthusiasm for brain-machine interfaces, for instance, I heard people talking about Stellac earlier. Actually, that idea of merging with your technology is pretty silly, because one of the things that you will discover is that the technology that you merge with goes out of date really quickly. If I have some big surgery to put my mobile phone, you could surgically implant your mobile phone nowadays. 5 years down the track, your mobile phone probably doesn't work because they've changed the network, and now you have to have surgery to update yourself. So, in general, your response to obsolescence should be to keep the technology outside of the human body, update the technology, and stay the same. Genetic modification you can't do again. You only get one chance at being genetically modified. You don't choose that for yourself, your parents choose it for you. Maybe the state mandates it. Interesting arguments about state-mandated genetic modification. But once you're modified, you're stuck. So if the technology moves past you, you really do become obsolete. What would that be like? It's actually harder to work out than you might think. I've spent quite a bit of time in another paper called Avoiding an Enhanced Rat Race. I spent a bit of time thinking about what would life be like if younger people had superior genes? Well, when I hit the job market at the age of 18, if I'm genetically modified, if I'm enhanced, then I am a hot ticket item. I'm better than any other human being that's been before. Think, woohoo, okay, I can laugh at all the older people because you guys, your genes are not as good as my my genes. But that doesn't last for very long. Now the younger people are hitting the job market, and all of a sudden they're laughing at me, and there's nothing I can do about it because they have a superior set of genes to me. So it's good to be enhanced. It may even be obligatory to be enhanced. Once you can start to do, if you could do this stuff, failure to genetically enhance your child might come to be seen as a form of child abuse, because your child, you could have made your life much better. It's a bit like not teaching your child to read. Okay, if I didn't teach my kids to read, I didn't send them to school at all, the state might take me to court and say, look, this is a form of child abuse. You get a similar thing happening with culturally deaf parents who don't want their kids to have cochlear implants. And someone says, well, look, you're letting your kid grow up deaf. They say, yes, because we love to be deaf. Okay, and the state said, well, but that's bad for your child, that's a form of child abuse. So you can imagine a future in which the state is mandating a minimum standard package of genes. Over the course of your life, however, you spend more time being obsolete than being enhanced. And depending on what you think about the relative impact of what's called upward or downward social comparison, one of the interesting things about human happiness is we're very status conscious creatures. You know, I have to be very careful to give my young daughters exactly the same presents. Okay, because if there's any variation, even in the colour, my oldest daughter will immediately have a hissy fit and demand what her sister's been given. Okay, she's she's got envious preferences. We are constantly comparing ourselves to other people. Sometimes you think, I'm better than you, that gives me a little bit of a buzz. Other times you think, oh shit, you've got more money, nicer car, whatever it is, better life, that makes me feel miserable. Some evidence to suggest that we're more inclined to compare ourselves to people who are better off than us, and that makes us more miserable. If you tell someone, thank God that aren't you happy that you don't live in South Sudan? People get like a moment of happiness out of that. They think, oh yeah, that's good, I don't live in South Sudan. But then they just look at their next door neighbour who's got more bling than them, and that makes them actually more miserable. If that's true, then this stuff would be really bad you get a net decrease in human happiness because you spend most of your life regretting the enhancements that you don't have. This is a real problem for parents. Option regret is when you feel unhappy about the choices that you didn't make. I don't know if you've ever had that experience. If you buy a new laptop, some of us are what's called maximizers and some of us are satisficers. Satisficers want things that are good enough. Maximizers want the best stuff. If you can, you should be a satisficer. Okay, satisficers are much happier. Maximizers obsess on the internet. Is the latest Apple versus the latest Surface Pro, whatever, which is better? Finally make a choice, bring it home, open it up, get online, a new model has been released. Damn, I should have waited. That's going to be disastrous if it's your child. I have my child, and then 2 weeks later, someone comes out with a new bundle of genes that would have doubled my kid's life expectancy. My whole life, I'm going to regret the choice that I didn't make. It'll turn out that there's never the right time to have a child. Because the longer you wait, the better life your child will have, because the better set of genes that they would have. You get this compression of period of full social participation. I'll come to you in a moment. It's already the case that eventually you are aged out of full social participation. You struggle to participate in society, in government, in the workplace, by virtue of this sort of your cultural skill sets becoming obsolete. But in this future that I'm imagining, the younger people are really much better than you very quickly. So it's like you age very, very quickly. And so the time when Microsoft wants to employ you is really brief now, only when you're young. Now, you wanted to make a comment on?
I'm just wondering if you have a possible business venture for the future, thinking about children a bit like car leasing. you could give people a deal where every year you give them a new baby and guarantee it's the latest model.
You could, but that's not what people are after when they have children. Yep.
I know that the novel 1984 is better known, but I seem to recall reading at about the same time Aldous Huxley's Brave New World,
Yes.
where the means of reproduction had ceased to be what we view as normal sex, I believe.
Yes.
Do you think that novel was, okay, it may be wrong in details, but was it plausible?
I think it's already the case that reproductive technology has radically changed the way that people experience reproduction, for instance. And some of that is it's actually just bog standard in vitro fertilisation makes it much harder to accept infertility nowadays, for instance. Once upon a time, people tried to have babies, couldn't have babies, said, okay, I'm not going to have babies, made a happy life without babies. Now there's 10 years of high-tech reproductive intervention to try to have babies. It's become much harder, particularly for women, to choose to be childless. Yes, later is a bit more complicated than that. But yet, people are already... there's a push for instance, national screening for genes associated with cystic fibrosis, with the thought that we will eliminate cystic fibrosis by using pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. You will detect more people who are carriers of CF, and if there's a risk that their child will have CF, you encourage them to use IVF pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and we will eliminate that condition from the gene pool. Rates of children born with trisomy 21 or Down syndrome are only remaining stable because women are having more children at a later age. If the average age of conception and birth had remained the same, we would see a massive collapse in the number of Downs pregnancies that are going to term. And some of this stuff has the competitive edge that Huxley was pointing to, because the options available to me in reproduction are affected by the choices that other people make. So for instance, there's some genetic conditions where if your child has that condition in a big city, you can access specialist support. There's enough people with the condition in Melbourne that your child can get the resources that they need. But if you live in Shepparton, your child is going to have a radically worse life, because the impact on your child depends upon how many other kids have the condition. If everyone else is screening for the condition and eliminating it, then it becomes much harder for people to make the choice to let nature take its course. Notice, it's not obvious to me that humanists should be opposed to this technology. Like, there are genetic conditions out there that are genuinely terrible for
given that people have moved from different climates, perhaps eliminating red-headedness. Or a warm climate.
Absolutely. I mean, I've done quite a bit of work about thinking about genetic selection for skin colour, for instance.
That's political, but I meant hair colour.
But no, skin colour is a cancer risk or a vitamin D risk. In Australia, we should all have dark skin. That's why the Indigenous population, it is much better. If your child is born with dark skin, two things happen. They will suffer from racism, and that'll be bad for them. But they will also have less skin cancer, and that'll be good for them. Now, interestingly, most of us don't think that we should respond to systematic social injustice by eliminating people like that. And that's part of what's called the disability critique of prenatal testing. One response, I'm radically off topic here, okay, but one response that the community of people with disabilities have to all of this technology is to say, look, I'm not bad. The problem is with you guys. The problem is a society that is hostile to people like me. And it's only becoming more hostile to people like me when there are fewer people like me, because they are now being policed out of existence at birth. when the impact on the child's life looks to be the result of systematic social injustice, most people think that you shouldn't make the choice at the level of reproduction. Which is why, for instance, if I pointed out that it's better to be born male rather than female in Bangladesh, for instance, most people wouldn't say, oh great, let's make sure that everyone's born a boy. You would say, actually no, the problem there is society. You know, mixed race couple having kids in the contemporary United States, there'd be real reasons to have the lighter skinned kid, okay? Because being black in a public place in the US is a health risk. Almost no philosophers put up their hand for that one. I've done that test extensively. You have to be a pretty hardcore advocate of human enhancement to say it's better to be white rather than black in the US, even though you struggle to explain racism without saying actually racism is bad for African Americans. There are real differences in people's welfare that are determined by their genetics in relation to society. Men and women, gay, straight, black and white. You can point to real differences in people's welfare depending upon where they sit in relation to those categories. And if you believe you should always have the best child possible, it's pretty hard not to think that you should have like the white, straight, 6'1" baby. That is I think of that as a repugnant conclusion, but it's really hard to argue against, actually. It turns out to be really hard to explain how you should choose a worse life for your child because of your moral principles, okay? That you're not imposing suffering on your child as a result of society's systematic racism. Anyway, I need to move on because I'm imposing on your patience long enough. Generation of enhancement becomes a new means of social stratification. You can imagine a sort of genetic underclass. The first people who are genetically modified, the people who are not genetically modified, they have pretty crap lives in a future in which everyone else is living to be 200. Your life insurance, your medical care is all much cheaper if you're genetically modified.
But you have to pay it longer.
Yes, but you get a lower rate.
Then you get Blade Runner, don't you?
Well, this stuff is all... I do think that at one level I want to concede that some of this stuff is science fiction, because when it comes down to it, I think people will try to genetically modify their kids. Some of it will work, some of it won't. Then climate change will have us all racing for the hills, and people will give up on this stuff. I've got two interests in this. Partially, my interest is in exposing what I think are the bad arguments of another group of philosophers and scientists. But partially I'm interested in what we can learn about what it is to be human by thinking about these kinds of science fiction technologies. In particular, what does it say about our attitude towards disability, for instance, when we start thinking about enhancement? So I don't think this is... The scenario of rapid technological progress, I think, is science fiction, but I don't think that my conclusions are irrelevant to the real world because of that. I'll gloss this, but the take-home message in this paper is to look at a really old criticism of genetic modification that said you're going to turn people into products. When I do design, the term designer babies is supposed to be a sort of boo word. It's supposed to be obviously bad to design your babies, because to design your babies is to turn them into things. And that's an old argument in the literature. It was there in Hans Jonas's work in the mid-1960s. Jürgen Habermas, famous German philosopher, makes this argument in a book called The Future of Human Nature around the turn of the millennium. And people said, look, what's wrong with genetically modifying your child is you're relating to them as an artifact. That argument is more complicated than people think, because parents are always modifying their kids. To be a parent is to shape your child. Even if you just throw up your hands and say, eat all the chocolate you like, that has long-term implications for your child. Parenting always has an instrumental moment where I try to do something for the sake of my child.
Nurture.
Sorry? Nurture.
Epigenetics.
As against nature.
Yes, but but nurture presupposes that parents genuinely know best or society knows best. You're modifying your child through environmental modification, which is why some philosophers say, well, what's wrong with genetic modification? I can modify you environmentally, or I can modify you genetically. We accept environmental modification. Why shouldn't we accept genetic modification? But there is something in this intuition that the relationship you have with an artifact is different to the relationship you have with another human being. Another human being can always potentially argue back, whereas an object is mute and inert. And so Habermas talks about an instrumental mode of relationship towards the child that is involved in genetic modification. My argument about obsolescence is supposed to reinforce that. It's to say, look, if you think of your child as the kind of thing that can become obsolete, you really are thinking of them as a technological artifact and as a product. So that my most sort of original philosophical contribution to the literature is to point out that if you see obsolescence in the way that I've described, you get a new reason for taking Habermas and Hans Jonas and various other people who said when we start to genetically modify human beings, we shift them in relation to our ontology from ends in themselves to artifacts that are in a relationship to the ends of others. And that's the sense in which I think when in a world in which human beings became obsolete, I think they would be fundamentally different kinds of creatures. In particular, now, my students always think that they are the best thing since sliced bread because they've got phones and computers. Okay, but they don't realise that Aristotle was smarter than them. Interestingly, my students can't read stuff that was written 50 years ago because the sentences are too long. Seriously, you read the old philosophy, it's much harder than the new philosophy. Okay, if we are superior in some sense, it's because of our technology and our culture, not because of the kind of creatures that we are. We are fundamentally the same kind of creatures as Aristotle. The difference between us and Aristotle is cultural change. That won't be true in the future. The difference will be in our genes, that you'll get this decisive rupture in human history. I'm going to skip all the rest of that because I've been up here for quite some time. Just mention, if I were designing a baby for a world in which they became obsolete, I would have to take obsolescence into account in the design process. I would have to design my child for a world in which they became obsolete. So there's an interesting redoubling of the design moment that, again, no one else has.
Would you make their lifespan less so that you wouldn't have to have this long period of...
I don't...
No, you make them resilient.
Yes. You'd be trying to make them... You try to make them resilient, less prone to social comparison, for instance, more concerned with absolute goods rather than status goods. I don't really buy the "it's good to die young" argument. I think that's a young person's argument. Okay, and if I said, look, while I've been giving this talk, I released a vial of radon gas that cut 5 years off your life expectancy, no one would say, fantastic, great, now I don't need to confront old age. People would see that as a form of abuse. So yeah, I think life expectancy is actually one of the things that people are most likely to enhance. And in fact, human beings have radically increased life expectancies. It's kind of interesting, this has been reversed in contemporary America. For instance, was famously reversed when the Soviet Union collapsed. Male life expectancy in particular collapsed, but for most of us, life expectancy keeps going up. Again, it's an enhancement through environmental technologies. I might, yada, yada, yada. It is a weird argument. Let me say that. This is a weird argument. Things are going to get better, so we should be worried. Okay, there's a sense in which, I'm taught technological improvement is bad because it produces obsolescence. That's facetious. I'm not really arguing that. But there's a moment in this. You should worry about whether this is a Luddite argument. I don't want to be a Luddite. I'm not a Luddite. But I've said technological progress will produce all these problems. It's a pretty weird reason to want to reject technological progress. I'll just flag that. If you want to read it, you can read it. I will stop there. I'll take a question from Adam and then come back over here. Yep.
Okay, now Granted that obsolescence may occur if there are an irreversible and unupgradable form of germline gene therapy applied to a person.
Yep.
If that is the case for all gene therapies, let's just assume that is.
Yep.
Because it may not be the case if we were using somatic gene therapy.
Yeah. You simply won't get large impacts on somatic cell gene therapy is really just a bad drug therapy.
At the moment, but yes, we're just...
Yeah, but I could never grow an extra arm. There's phenotypic changes that you could make to the human being at an embryonic stage that you'll never be able to make through somatic cell changes. You can tweak metabolism a little bit. You might be able to ameliorate various metabolic disorders.
Let's see,
Yep.
really. We can't know until we've actually really done the research, and we can't know what we'll discover tomorrow. It does seem promising to some, less promising to others, but there are a broad range of enhancement technologies which seem to be coming on the horizon, which people could update and that are more modular than a one-shot genetic germline enhancement. What about those types of enhancements?
This argument just doesn't apply. I was upfront about that. This argument of obsolescence only works if you can't update yourself. That range of things is actually wider than you might think. Turns out this is true for surgery. For instance, there's a surgical outcome curve with surgeries. You don't want to be the first person. Surgery keeps improving. Okay, surgeons keep working on the surgery. Surgery gets better and better. You don't want to be the first person to have the new surgery. No one knows how to do it. They haven't worked it out fully. That'll go badly wrong. You don't want to be the last person to have a surgery because there's a better surgery. There's a good moment to have a surgery, which is when the surgeon, it's still the state-of-the-art surgery, but the surgeons can do it. People have worked it out, and then nothing new is on the horizon. But interestingly, there's lots of surgeries that you can't undo or do over and over again. So I don't know if anyone's confronting the hip implant, the hip replacement stuff. There's a limited number of hip replacements that you can have. There's even drugs, pharmaceutical drugs. The best enhancement technology turns out to be nicotine, closely followed by caffeine. Seriously, nicotine, maybe amphetamines. Those are really powerful drugs. Nicotine in particular, really powerful psychoactive chemical. Maybe in the future there'll be better drugs, but the interesting thing, you don't want to keep upgrading your drugs because you might know that a lifetime of smoking is bad in some ways, good in others, but the kind of person who takes each generation of drug as it comes along, you're in for a world of weird side effects. So even something like a drug, which you think I could stop taking the old drug, start taking the new drug, so I could update my enhancement, doesn't work as well as people might think for drug therapies. Anything that basically inside the human body, you kind of want to avoid because every surgery is dangerous. We're moving towards a world where we may not have antibiotics anymore, in which case you just don't want to go anywhere near hospitals. Now, I'll go here because we haven't, here. So I don't know how you do this. Do I just wave my hands around and take questions at this point?
That'll do, Robert. If you want to do it that way, that's fine.
Yeah.
Or we can give you a break if you'd like a break.
No, this is what I do. So I'm down with it. I'll go here.
Are you aware that in 1947, two Australian women who wrote under the name Barnard Eldershaw wrote a book called Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow about Australia in 2040. Have you read it?
No, I haven't read it. I am aware that it exists, but yeah.
But the thing is, the society, the way it's structured, the children of the upper class at the age of 18 to 30 are educated and have tasks and lead a life and get married. And then at the age of 30, only 1 or 2% are given things to do. The rest live in relative comfort. But meanwhile, they have the serfs who they've modified to do all the hard work. And it was very hard. This book was very heavily censored by the Australian government.
Okay. Yeah. No. I'm weak on Australian literature. I would admit that. It's being good at anything nowadays requires you to specialise. So I do this stuff, I'm not great on the literature. One thing I should flag, part of my real interest, I can see this in people's eyes, there is something totalitarian and fascistic about this project. But interestingly, it's not obviously wrong either, which is why the history of eugenics is so interesting. Okay, because humanists were down with eugenics. So, okay, people think of eugenics as a fascist project, but it was also a Fabian project. This idea that you should give your child a better life, you should use science and technology to give your child a better life, that kind of looks progressive to me. It looks rationalist. But at the same time, if I start talking about superior genomes and policing who comes into existence, that looks totalitarian. That's why I'm interested in this stuff. And part of the sort of broader picture of my intellectual engagement, I'm interested in human enhancement because it's the place where social Darwinist ideas are re-emerging at the moment. Okay, the Journal of Medical Ethics has been edited by these kind of radical utilitarians and transhumanists for the last decade or so. I am so sick of supervising young students who think it's absolutely obvious that we should compel people to genetically modify their kids, or that we should compel people to accept medical treatment in order to receive social assistance. Old liberal arguments are being swept aside in this new enthusiasm for technological progress. I talk about enhancement in part to sort of work with that tension. This is medicine. Some of this stuff is great. Your kid isn't going to die of some terrible genetic disorder. But the long-term sort of dynamic of this thing is to push, it's 6'1", blonde, blue-eyed, like Aryan folk. That's what human enhancement means culturally. So there's this really interesting sort of connection to science fiction and utopian literature. I'll go here, and then this gentleman had something earlier, and then here, and then here. Yep. So yes, please. Yep.
I have difficulties coming to terms with that you're going to enhance society if people are going to become obsolete. Aren't we just having people living a long life and have nothing to do with them with their life because they've become obsolete, and we're going to have great tradition? Okay, good.
Writing about reproductive technology nowadays is structured by distinction that people make between what they call the old and the new eugenics. Okay, because as a society, we really are now starting to police who gets to be born. Okay, if you have a family history of genetic disease, you are strongly encouraged to have a whole series of genetic tests and maybe terminate the pregnancy. Women are routinely, pregnancy now involves a whole series of imaging and tests where kind of in most cases the only thing you can do is have a termination. People say, oh, you could get ready for your birth of your novel child, but those technologies, and sometimes this is really explicit when people make the case for funding some new test, they say it'll cost a lot of money to support people with this condition in our community. It'll cost this much to roll out universal screening. It will reduce the number of people in our population. It's in society's best interests to roll out the test. People should be very cautious about that line of argument. Anyway, the distinction between the old and the new eugenics is supposed to be the new eugenics. The old eugenics was bad because it was coercive. It murdered people. It was racist. It was based on bad science. And it was oriented towards populations. Have the child that is good for Germany. Have the baby that is good for Australia. The new eugenics is supposed to be based on good science, is pro-choice, makes an argument about reproductive freedom, and is oriented towards the welfare of your child. The reason why you do this stuff is for your child's sake. And people don't want to go to have the baby that's good for Australia. They say this is all about have the best child you can have for the sake of your child, not for the sake of you, but as a parent, you should care about your child's welfare. I can improve my child's welfare by making sure that they don't have any number of genes, and maybe I put some new genes in, it'll be good for them. So this is an individualist project. Now, you're absolutely right, the aggregate outcome is bad. along the lines that you described, but some people now are saying, look, we should look at the whole of society, think what kind of genes that people should have, and then make sure there are those kinds of genes. That's the full Brave New World argument. Someone's got to sweep the streets. Let's make sure that they love street sweeping. And that would be good for total aggregate utility. Yeah, actually, robots cleaning a room is still going to be the immigrant woman from the former Baltic states. I mean, robots, I work on the ethics of robots. Robots struggle in cluttered environments. Anyway, in general, these arguments are all about the welfare of the child, and the aggregate consequences, people worry about them, but they're not at the foreground of the argument. The moment someone starts talking about, but what about society, you should point to cases where, I mean, I've written a paper about a situation. I'm intrigued by what's called I'm intrigued by disability. I have some disabilities. There's a powerful argument that says, look, things that society thinks are bad are actually good. Okay, having a bit of suffering in your life is good for you. You achieve new insights. Our mortality makes us confront the universe, and that's great. There's arguments to say, look, we are too quick to think that it's fantastic to be bright, to be perfect. We've got too narrow a vision. Actually, there's all sorts of human variations that are compatible with a good human life. That's an interesting argument. That's a kind of plausible argument. But now you imagine a world in which there's some sort of geotectonic shift, and all the kids are born perfect. They're all clones. Everyone has the same baby, one boy, one girl. They're all great. People say, how boring. Who's going to put up their hand to have the redhead? Who's going to put up the hands to have the child, that has crippling arthritis? That might be good for the world. Society might be richer. There's an argument, it's not a nice argument, but you can make an argument that having homeless people on the street is good for society. Because when I step over them, I get a buzz. They're miserable. People aren't going to admit this, no one admits this in public. But if you've ever had that thought, there but for the grace of God go I, and you felt happy about your life, I count my blessings, that's not me sleeping in the gutter. If enough people have that moment, then a world with homeless people in it has higher aggregate welfare. That's a pretty revolting argument. Saying that it's good for people to have impairments, it's good for people to have these crippling diseases because the rest of us can be nice to them, for instance. And interesting, there are people who make that argument. They say, look, we need to live in a world where there's an opportunity to express care and love for each other. If everyone were born perfect, a whole series of you couldn't have Mother Teresa, because there was no one suffering. Wouldn't that be disastrous? We got to find some people and make them suffer.
She did a shocking job.
Yeah, no. But can you see that once you go to the aggregate, once you go to society, you can get all sorts of perverse outcomes. It may be, for instance, having sort of genetic scapegoats. People are genetically modified to be organ donors, a la, The Island or Never Let Me Go. All of that stuff might turn out to be good for society. Seems obviously wrong to me that we should make some people's lives worse for the sake of aggregate welfare. Yeah. Anyway, so you're right, there's this real tension between individual welfare, aggregate. I could talk about this stuff forever, sorry. I've been obsessed with this for 15 years now, so. Let's go here and then here. Yep.
Thank you. My brain hurts up what you've just been saying. I've got a really trivial question now. You mentioned increasing life expectancy, and going back to my earlier question about the plateauing of evolution and technology,
yep.
Is our maximum life expectancy actually increasing, or is it just that through better health, more of us are reaching that maximum life expectancy?
Well, I mean, look, life expectancy is a statistical concept. Okay, so life expectancy will increase if more. The question you're asking is better expressed as, is the maximum age that people reach increasing? I don't know that for certain, and because the vast number of people who are alive, you only need one to set the maximum age of a human being. That's going to be changed much more slowly. There is a question. There is a question about how much we could increase human capacities through these kinds of genetic modifications. You couldn't increase cranial size. Once you start, you think, oh, look, I'll make my kid with a brain twice as big. Well, now you've got to modify the bone growth. Then it turns out that their head, falls off. So then you have to modify their neck musculature, and before you know it, you're redesigning the entire organism. I can't imagine doing any of that. So, it is an open question how much a series of small genetic tweaks could actually increase human welfare. Again, I'm skeptical that we'll ever really know, because it would take, a lot depends on whether you think of, if we've got 300 years of developing this technology, you can really imagine a world with radical genetic modification. If, as I think is more likely, we're confronting civilizational collapse in the next kind of 5 decades, then this is not really on the list. This is a kind of classic wealthy person's problem. Yep. There was a question here earlier.
When the Chinese scientists produced 2 babies resistant to HIV,
yep,
there was shock, horror, and a lot of criticism.
Yes.
How is it any worse than eliminating cystic fibrosis?
So that's indeed I think that's what he thought. Some people think that the ethics of selection and the ethics of modification are actually radically different. So genetic selection is choosing which embryo versus taking one embryo and modifying it. This is controversial, and there is an enormous literature that I would encourage you not to get involved in on what's called the non-identity problem, Derek Parfit's famous non-identity problem. But imagine there's a genetic test for cystic fibrosis. My parents are hippies, and so they don't have it. I'm born with cystic fibrosis. I'm facing a lung transplant, and I say to Mum and Dad, you bastards, why didn't you choose another embryo? What they can say is, had we done that, you would not have been better off, because someone else would have been born. So that what's called the counterfactual comparison, normally when we're thinking about harm and benefit, we say, what would my life have been like if my wife hadn't left me, or if I'd won the lottery? You compare what is to what would have been, but you hold yourself constant. If I say, what would my life have been like had I been born 2 years later? That looks as though there's no answer to that question. The child my parents had 2 years after me was my sister, not me. So embryo selection maybe doesn't harm or benefit people because the counterfactual comparison fails. I can't complain that my parents didn't choose another embryo. But interestingly, if my parents genetically modified me, and then it goes horribly wrong, and it turns out that I get, they thought that they were doubling my IQ, in fact, they were giving me liver cancer, I can say, Mum and Dad, you bastards, why did you do that? Okay, now they may have an excuse because they didn't know, but in a situation where you hold the individual fixed and modify their capacities, you can do the counterfactual comparison. So some people think that genetic modification is much higher risk, because if it goes wrong, and to be frank, it looked as though that experiment did go wrong, that you actually harmed people. The other thing with cystic, again, it depends what you think of. What the moral significance of normal human health is right in this literature. Because the whole idea of enhancement, most people are down with therapy. Most people embrace therapy. Okay, if my child was, fetal heart valve surgery, for instance, vitamin supplements, there's all sorts of things we do to try to ensure kids are born healthy. Most people think that's good. You should do that. But trying to make a super baby, people all of a sudden go, yeah, shouldn't do that. That's one of the moments where humanists should prick up their humanist ears and say that looks like a religious. Normal is not normatively significant. Normal is changing. Okay, if I said, oh, woe is me, my child's got a life expectancy of 87, what about the good old days when they had a life expectancy of 40? Modern medicine's unnatural. That's not an argument that progressives should endorse. So yes, I wish I could remember the gentleman's name, but certainly I think he thought this was straightforward, that vaccinating people against HIV was a good thing to do. It turns out, one of the things with HIV is there's other ways to avoid getting it. So an expensive and experimental genetic modification that the kids had no choice in looks dodgy. But I'm serious. If it had been George Church at Harvard, there's a whole series of American scientists who are desperate to do that experiment. And the shock, if you read the responses from the scientists, it's really clear they don't want to criticise him too much, because actually that's what they've developed this technology for. They are selling this technology to do precisely what he did. What they don't like is that he went early without consulting to any. Okay, so one thing, I'm not making an argument about what the law should be. Actually, I even haven't made an argument to say you should or shouldn't genetically modify your child. I'm just saying if society goes down this path, we've got to prepare for this possibility of obsolescence. That looks ethically relevant. There are reasons to be worried about state control of reproduction. That is the old eugenics, but also it's hard to see how you could not have regulation in this area, particularly as that you're looking at a whole series of what's called collective action problems, okay, where we all agree it's bad to do this, but each of us individually think, well, I'd better do it because I don't know what you other bastards are going to do. So it is hard to imagine a world in which this stuff isn't regulated. Again, I'm not making an argument about regulation. I do think that there are some deep problems in the notion of ethical expertise. I'm very interested in the notion of ethical expertise. Right. Yeah. Well, again, when most of the stuff that people say, particularly in the popular press about genes, is just wrong. And these are all the things that people used to say about the endocrine system. For instance, we just roll out the same racist and classist notions, and we dress them up in the latest kind of pseudoscience, and then we all, pretend. Nonetheless, science is kind of working away. There are truths about these matters. We do know more about the genome than we did in the past, and we would expect to know more in the future. I do think we need to have a sort of, vigorous public debate about it, but I'm suspicious of panels of experts. I certainly think that one of the things that my life has taught me is you can be really bright and still a fool. There are also, I'm constantly on panels with high-flying engineers who have invented a machine that goes ping, and it's a great machine that goes ping, and then you ask them about politics and history and they are clueless. In the same way that I'm clueless, you wouldn't ask me to build a bloody robot, okay? I have an expertise in philosophy. I don't know anything about how to build a robotic knee, for instance, but you can be bright in one area and clueless in another, and for that reason, panels of experts are really dangerous. Yep. Now, this gentleman has been waiting patiently.
When the first vaccination came into existence, which I believe was for smallpox,
yep,
the president of, translated into our terms, the vice chancellor of Yale University deplored it because he believed that it was interference in God's work.
Yep.
And likewise, currently, US laws have stymied money for stem cell research on religious grounds. Likewise, when you mentioned, what do you think about the HIV, the Chinese professor who allegedly produced anti-HIV? Well, of course, the religious right in the States would say they would deplore that because they would say, and they did, that HIV was God's message against the sick.
Right. Yep.
Have you got a question?
Yeah.
So the question is, the question that I have though is that if you do genetic modification on one generation, does that mean that the children, the naturally conceived
Yeah, they will.
children of that person then have those?
Yes, yes. So this is one. So Adam mentioned it earlier. These are germline modifications. Your child would also inherit the gene. For some people, that's a hard line because they say you can't consent. You can't consent on behalf of your children. Again, we're all born with genes that we didn't choose. So there is something strange about saying I can't choose better genes for my kids. They will be born with those genes. I'm not a religious person. I'm certainly not a religious conservative. I do think that people need to be careful in thinking that the enemy today is the church. When it comes to what's shaping this technology, it's capitalism. It's not religion is fiddling around at the edges and prohibiting various things. But the forces that are shaping the world at the moment, it's capitalism that is driving it. So I think this is important for how you frame your critique. I could pretend to be the new Voltaire defending human enhancement against the religious right, and lots of my colleagues do that. So it's pretty easy to make the argument for enhancement. What's hard is to explain why we have any reservations about it. Most of the arguments that people make against human enhancement are bad arguments. Some of my colleagues think this is a bad argument. For me, the hard task is to explain why we should resist the impact of the free market into the human genome, if we should. Lots of people think that they're going to become famous by arguing against the conservatives who are stopping us realising the brave new world. But the brave new world now is not the state. It's not state mandated. China's an interesting possible exception there. But those are capitalist societies as well. So if you were looking for what the future looks like, it's the market that is driving that. And for me, the interesting question is to say, have we got reasons to resist? Okay, now if that means sometimes I line up with conservatives, that's a price I'm willing to pay, because those arguments are easy to deal with. The hard thing is to explain why we shouldn't just allow parents to do whatever they want. It's their bodies, their kids, the welfare of the kids at stake. Open slather, let the future go. One of the reasons why we shouldn't do that is obsolescence. I will stop there.
That's a great place to come on.